Imagine standing on a frozen airfield in the Soviet Union. The temperature is minus 28 degrees Celsius. The wind cuts through leather and wool like a blade made of nothing but cold. Around you, mechanics are scraping ice from the engine cowlings of aircraft that might kill you before the enemy ever gets a chance. You've been shot down once this week already. Your hands still carry the memory of fire. And yet, in 30 minutes, you'll climb back into that cockpit, strap yourself into 300 kilograms of aviation fuel and machine guns, and fly straight toward an enemy air force with over 15,000 operational aircraft. You are 20 years old. You're not afraid. That is the detail that should disturb you most. Because fear in the skies above the Eastern Front in 1942 was the only rational response to what was happening up there. And yet, somehow impossibly, a young man from a small German town not only conquered his fear, he turned it into something precise, cold, and devastatingly effective. Something that would make him the most lethal fighter pilot in the entire history of human aerial combat. This is not a story about bravado. It is not a story about recklessness. It is a story about patience, discipline, and a single idea developed by one man that no one else believed in until bodies of enemy aircraft started stacking up across 2,000 kilometers of Soviet sky. By the time this man finally put his plane down for the last time, he had been officially credited with 352 aerial victories. 352. To put that number in context, the leading American ace of World War II, Richard Bong, scored 40 victories and was celebrated as a national hero. 40. The leading British ace, Marmaduke Paddle, reached 41 before he was killed. The most successful Soviet pilot, Ivan Kozadub, scored 64. Those are extraordinary numbers. They represent careers of extraordinary courage and skill. And yet they are fractions of what this one man achieved. His name was Erich Hartmann. And the story of how he built that number, aircraft by aircraft, engagement by engagement, through 16 crash landings, through capture and escape, through fire and ice and the slow collapse of everything Germany had believed in. That story is one of the most remarkable individual accomplishments in the history of modern warfare. But to understand it, you first have to understand the sky in which he operated, because it was not a sky that should have allowed anyone to survive, let alone dominate. The Eastern Front was not a front. That is the first thing to understand. It was a catastrophe rendered in geography. Stretching from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south, the German-Soviet combat zone in 1942 covered roughly 4,000 kilometers of contested territory. The distances were so vast that individual battles often went unrecorded simply because there was no one left to write the report. Aircraft that went down in Soviet territory frequently disappeared entirely. Pilot, machine, and record all swallowed by the endless flat expanse of steppe. The Soviet Air Force in this period, the Voyeno-Voznitsny Sily, the VVS, was enormous. By late 1942, Soviet aviation production was outpacing German production by a factor of nearly 3-to-1. Stalin's factories, relocated east of the Ural Mountains beyond the reach of German bombers, were producing aircraft at a rate the Wehrmacht could barely comprehend. The Yakovlev Yak, 1, the Lag 3, and later the La 5 and Yak 9 were not inferior aircraft. They were improving rapidly, driven by lessons learned in blood. Soviet pilots were aggressive, disciplined by necessity, and willing to accept losses that would have been operationally catastrophic for any Western Air Force. German pilots operating on the Eastern Front in 1942 were outnumbered, often by ratios of 5 or 6-to-1 in any given engagement. Their logistical chain was stretched past the point of logic. Spare parts arrived slowly if they arrived at all. Mechanics worked in temperatures that froze hydraulic fluid and cracked engine casings. The average life expectancy of a Luftwaffe pilot on the Eastern Front, in the most dangerous periods, has been estimated at weeks, not months. In this environment, the standard doctrine of aerial combat, high-speed slashing attacks, boom and zoom engagements, maximum aggression, was producing results, but it was also producing casualties. Even experienced pilots were dying at rates that made careful commanders deeply uncomfortable. Skill, aggression, and excellent aircraft were not always enough. There was something missing, some edge that could not be manufactured by courage alone. A 19-year-old arriving at Jageschwader 52 in November 1942 was about to discover what that edge was. He was born on April 19, 1922, in Weissach im Tal, a small town in the state of Württemberg in southwestern Germany. His mother, Elizabeth, was a licensed pilot, an extraordinary fact for any woman in interwar Europe, let alone in a small German village in the 1920s. She was the person who first put Erich in a glider. He was 8 years old. The sky, from that moment, was not something above him. It was something inside him. He grew quickly into a serious student of aviation. By the time he was 14, he had joined the Hitler Youth's glider program and was already demonstrating an instinct for three-dimensional spatial thinking that set him apart from his peers. He could visualize where an aircraft would be in 30 seconds based on its current vector and speed. He could feel, without instruments, whether an engine note was running true. These were not skills that could be taught in a classroom. They were gifts, but gifts sharpened day after day by a mother who understood flight and by a discipline unusual in a teenager. He completed his formal Luftwaffe pilot training in 1942 and was assigned to 3, Gruppe of Jageschwader 52, JG-52, stationed in the southern sector of the Eastern Front. JG-52 will become the most successful fighter wing in aviation history. The unit would eventually accumulate over 10,000 aerial victories. But in November 1942, when Erich Hartmann stepped off the transport aircraft and breathed Soviet air for the first time, it was just another unit full of exhausted men flying their 5th or 6th tour duty over an unending battlefield. His first operational flight was something between embarrassing and nearly fatal. He was assigned as wingman to a veteran pilot. He became so fixated on a distant Soviet aircraft that he broke formation, dove alone into what he hoped was an attacking pass, lost sight of his target, became separated from the formation, nearly ran out of fuel, and crash-landed on a German airfield having accomplished nothing except frightening himself. His instructor, a decorated pilot named Sergeant Edmund Rossmann, was not impressed. But Hartmann was watching, and he was thinking. Every experienced pilot in his unit had something he was trying to understand. Not the courage. He had that already. Not the reflexes. His were exceptional. What he was trying to understand was how they decided when to shoot, how they chose the moment, why some engagements ended in kills and others ended in chaos. He began to ask questions that other young pilots were too proud or too impatient to ask. He began to study the debriefs of veterans not for the narrative of the combat, but for the geometry, the angles, the distances, the specific moment, measured in fractions of a second, at which a properly positioned aircraft became a certainty rather than a gamble. What he discovered, gradually, through observation, and then through practice, was a principle that sounds almost too simple, almost obvious, until you understand how violently it contradicted everything most pilots believed. The principle was this: do not fire until the enemy aircraft fills your gun sight. Not a portion of it, not most of it, all of it. Let that sit for a moment, because it requires explanation. A standard aerial engagement in World War II was conducted at combat speeds of between 400 and 600 kilometers per hour. Aircraft closed on each other at closing speeds that could exceed 800 kilometers per hour when converging head-on. At those speeds, most fighter pilots began firing at ranges between 300 and 600 meters, sometimes even further, depending on confidence and weapon capability. This was partly about giving yourself time to react, partly about the psychology of combat, and partly because at that range you could still see the enemy aircraft clearly and believe you had a reasonable chance of hitting it. Hartmann's observation, developed through painful analysis of why so many deflection shots at medium range resulted in damaged aircraft rather than kills, was that the actual probability of decisive hit at those ranges was much lower than pilots assumed. The aircraft was too small a target. The relative motion was too complex. The trajectory of a round fired at 300 meters at a target, making even a slight turn, was influenced by wind, by the aircraft's own motion, by the convergent settings of the guns, by a dozen variables that most pilots couldn't consciously calculate. But at close range, very close range, inside 100 meters, sometimes inside 50, those variables collapsed. At that distance, Even a short burst from the Bf-109's 20mm cannon and pair of 7.92mm machine guns was nearly guaranteed to produce catastrophic damage. You could not miss an aircraft that was filling your entire windscreen. You could not fail to cause destruction when your rounds were traveling at that proximity. The problem, of course, was getting that close without being seen, without triggering the enemy's evasive response, and without colliding with the target. This is where Hartman's second discovery became equally important. He was not going to fight his way to close range through a knife fight. He was going to use the sun, clouds, and the natural blind spots of Soviet aircraft to position himself with such precision that by the time the enemy pilots saw him, the engagement was already over. He called his method, in simplified terms, see, decide, attack, break, for phases, executed without hesitation, in sequence. He would see an enemy aircraft before it saw him. He would decide, often choosing not to engage if the geometry wasn't perfect, pulling away and waiting rather than forcing a bad attack. Then he would attack once, from close range, with certainty. Then he would break away immediately, resetting for the next engagement rather than lingering in a turning dogfight, where advantages could reverse in seconds. This was not cowardice. This was engineering, and it worked at a level that his peers initially found difficult to accept as real. The victories began to accumulate in late 1942 and into 1943. Not in explosive surges, but in a steady, almost clinical progression. Hartman was developing not just a technique, but a philosophy. He would later describe the ideal engagement as lasting no more than a few seconds from the beginning of the final attack run to the break. If the geometry was wrong, if the enemy aircraft was turning, if there were other Soviet fighters nearby, if the sun angle was unfavorable, he would not attack. He would withdraw. He would wait. His patience in the air was so unusual among fighter pilots that some of his peers, not yet understanding his method, questioned his aggressiveness. Then the numbers started speaking for themselves. His 50th kill came in the summer of 1943. His 100th came in September that year, shortly before his 21st birthday. At the time, 100 aerial victories was a figure so extraordinary that it qualified a Luftwaffe pilot for the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, Germany's highest military decoration. Hartman received his, and he kept climbing. But the path was not clean, not linear, not a simple story of one man ascending while the world burned around him, because the Eastern Front had ways of reaching up and pulling even the best pilots out of sky. Hartman was shot down 16 times over the course of his combat career. The phrase shot down covers a range of experiences from a merely terrifying to the genuinely miraculous. Some of these were engine failures caused by debris from aircraft he had just destroyed, flying into the debris field of a target he had gotten too close to, which was an occupational hazard of his own method. Some were battle damage from enemy fire. Some were forced landings on territory that was technically behind Soviet lines. Each time, he walked or crawled or was dragged out of wreckage, and each time, after a period of recovery ranging from hours to days, he climbed back into another aircraft. The Bf-109 that he flew, in its various marks from the F through the G model, was a machine. He understood the way a musician understands a specific instrument. It was not the most maneuverable fighter of the war. It was not the fastest at all altitudes. But in the hands of a pilot who understood its strengths and refused to fight it in conditions where its weaknesses would be exposed, it was lethal. The narrow undercarriage that made it difficult to land on rough fields became irrelevant when you understood landing technique. The engine torque that could roll the aircraft during takeoff became manageable when you compensated instinctively. He had crashed enough of them to know exactly where the limits were. In August 1943, he had one of the most remarkable experiences of his entire war. Flying deep into Soviet-held territory, his aircraft was hit by anti-aircraft fire, and he was forced down behind enemy lines. He was captured by Soviet soldiers. The details of what followed read like something written by a novelist who believed realism was overrated. He faked a serious injury, was being transported by his captors in a vehicle, and when the column was attacked by German aircraft, he used the confusion to overpower a guard and escape on foot into the steppe. He walked for hours through territory that could have killed him in a dozen ways. Enemy soldiers, Soviet civilians with reason to be hostile, the landscape itself. He reached German lines and reported for duty. Days later, He was back in the Bf-109. The autumn of 1943 through the summer of 1944 marked a period when Hartmann's accumulation of kills became something that the Luftwaffe leadership itself struggled to process. By October 1943, he had surpassed the 200 victory mark, a number so far beyond anything achieved by any Allied pilot that it strained credibility among people who didn't know the Eastern Front. The Soviet Air Force, increasingly aware that one specific German pilot was responsible for a disproportionate share of their air losses in the southern sector, apparently placed a bounty on his aircraft. Soviet pilots began to recognize the markings of his Bf-109, which at various periods carried distinctive nose art, including a black tulip design painted on the cowling, and would reportedly break off engagements or attempt evasive maneuvers immediately upon identifying his aircraft. He responded in the only way that made sense to him. He had the markings removed. By the summer of 1944, as the broad arc of the war had turned decisively against Germany, Hartman was operating in a context of collapse. The Wehrmacht was retreating across much of the Eastern Front. Fuel was increasingly scarce. Replacement aircraft were arriving, but replacement pilots of any experience were nearly non-existent. JG-52 was covering retreat, flying multiple sorties per day, maintaining aircraft on fields that were sometimes being shelled as pilots took off. These were conditions in which even gifted pilots were dying regularly. On August 24, 1944, Erich Hartmann flew the mission that would become the definitive statement of his entire career. He was leading a formation over Romania when his aircraft was engaged by a large formation of Soviet fighters. What followed, according to the detailed combat records that survived, was an engagement in which Hartmann shot down 11 enemy aircraft in a single day. 11 in a single day's flying. His total credited victory score crossed the 300 mark. He was 22 years old. 2 weeks later, on September 2, 1944, he was awarded the Diamonds to the Knight's Cross, the highest decoration in the German military, awarded only to the most extraordinary individuals in the entire war. He was the youngest person ever to receive it. He had now been officially credited with 301 aerial victories. Goring himself reportedly told Hartmann to stop flying combat missions, that he was too valuable as a symbol to risk losing. Hartmann reportedly refused. The number kept climbing: 320, 330, 340. On May 8, 1945, the last day of the war in Europe, Erich Hartmann flew his final combat mission. He shot down 2 Soviet Yak-9s. His total stood at 352 confirmed aerial victories. He then flew his aircraft in his unit west, deliberately west, across the collapsing front, because he would not surrender to the Soviet forces he had spent 3 years fighting. He landed at an American-held airfield, taxied his Bf-109 to a stop, and climbed out. The war was over. What followed was, in many ways, a crueler ordeal than combat. Under the terms of Allied agreements made at Yalta, German forces captured in the American zone who had fought against Soviet forces were to be handed over to the Soviet Union. Hartmann was among them. He was arrested, transported east, and spent the next 10 years in Soviet captivity. He was tried for war crimes, convicted on charges that were fabricated and have been subsequently discredited by historians and by German government review. He was subjected to repeated interrogations, to periods of solitary confinement, to psychological pressure designed to make him either confess to crimes he had not committed or provide intelligence useful to Soviet aviation programs. He refused both. He went on hunger strikes. He was beaten. He endured. He was not released until October 1955, a decade after the war ended. He came home to Germany to find his country divided, his service records in pieces, and his former comrades either dead, imprisoned, or scattered across a changed world. He was 33 years old. He had spent a third of his adult life in captivity. He had a wife, Ursula, whom he had married in 1944, who had waited for him. He had a son he barely knew. He would rebuild. The West German Luftwaffe, the Bundeswehr's air arm, was reconstituted in 1956 as part of Germany's integration into NATO. Erich Hartmann was asked to join. He became a fighter pilot again, this time in the Cold War context, flying American-built F-86 Sabres and later F-104 starfighters. He reached the rank of Oberst, colonel, He commanded a wing. He trained a new generation of German pilots. He was not entirely at peace in this role. The jet age was different from the piston age in ways that went beyond the mechanical. The speeds were higher, the engagement envelopes were different, the weapons were changing from guns to missiles. He was skeptical of some of the changes, particularly the F-104's demanding flight characteristics in the weather conditions of Central Europe, and he was reportedly outspoken in expressing those concerns that events would vindicate, as the F-104 had a catastrophic accident rate in Luftwaffe service. He retired from the Bundeswehr in 1970. He lived quietly in retirement in Germany. He gave occasional interviews, always deflecting the focus from his victory total to the broader human cost of the war, speaking with visible discomfort about the celebratory framework that popular history insisted on placing around aerial combat. He was not a man who took pride in killing. He was a man who had found a way to survive a war and who had been extraordinarily effective at it, and who understood those two things as entirely different from heroism in any simple sense. He died on September 20th, 1993, in Wilhelmshaven, Germany. He was 71 years old. Ursula, the woman who had waited through the war and then through a decade of Soviet imprisonment, was with him. The legacy of Erich Hartmann is complicated in the way that all military legacies are complicated, and more so because of the war in which he fought. He served the Third Reich. That is a fact that cannot be isolated from the rest of his story. And there are legitimate historians who argue that the Western lionization of German Eastern Front fighter pilots as romantic warriors obscures the context in which they operated, a war of annihilation, conducted on behalf of a regime of extraordinary criminal intent. These arguments deserve engagement, not dismissal. At the same time, the technical achievement of what Hartmann accomplished in the air is simply without parallel in the history of aerial warfare. His record has stood for 80 years. It will almost certainly never be broken, not because the world will not produce pilots of comparable skill, but because the conditions that allow for 352 individual aerial victories in a single pilot's career, the scale of the Eastern Front, the duration of the conflict, the density of the opposing air forces, are conditions that no modern air war is likely to replicate. His record is a function of a specific, terrible, unrepeatable moment in history. What endures in aviation doctrine is the idea at the core of his method: patience over aggression, geometry over courage, the calculated, certain shot over the speculative, hopeful burst. Modern fighter pilot training, particularly in close-range engagement doctrine, still operates on versions of the principles he developed empirically over the Russian steppe in 1942 and 1943. When a training instructor today tells a student that the most dangerous pilot is not the most aggressive one, but the most patient one, that is an echo, filtered through decades of doctrine and technology, of something Erich Hartmann figured out while the wreckage of enemy aircraft was still falling around him. One man, one aircraft, 16 crash landings, 352 victories, 10 years in a Soviet prison, and a principle so simple and so devastating that it reshaped how an entire generation understood the geometry of the sky. He looked at the chaos of the Eastern Front, at the most violent, attrition-heavy aerial battlefield in history, and he chose not to fight it with more chaos. He chose precision. He chose patience. He chose to wait until he could not miss. In a war that destroyed everything it touched, that single discipline, that refusal to act until the moment was certain, was the closest thing to order that the sky above the Eastern Front ever produced. CTA Block, if you made it this far, you already know that this story is about more than aircraft and victory counts. It is about the terrifying capacity of a single human mind to find a system, a method, a discipline, even inside the most chaotic conditions imaginable. We all operate inside chaos of one kind or another. The question of how we find our own patience, our own precision, in the middle of it, that question belongs to all of us, not just to the pilots. If this documentary moved you, challenged you, or taught you something you didn't know, please hit the like button right now. I know that sounds like a standard ask, but it genuinely matters. The algorithm decides whether the story reaches another 10,000 people or stays hidden, and your like is the signal it needs. You're not just liking a video. You're deciding whether this history gets told. Subscribe to WW2 Ghost Wings if you haven't already. Every week we go back into the archives of the Second World War and pull out the stories that most history books don't have room for. The uncommon soldiers, the forgotten battles, the individuals whose names should be known but aren't. This channel exists for those stories, and it exists because of people like you who believe they're worth telling. Now I want to hear from you. Down in the comments, do you believe Hartmann's victory total is genuine, or do you think the chaos of the Eastern Front made independent confirmation impossible? This is one of the genuinely contested questions in military history, and I want to know where you stand. Our next video goes even deeper into the Eastern Front, and this time we're looking at a Soviet pilot who the Germans called a ghost, a man who flew with 2 prosthetic legs and still became one of Stalin's most feared aces. You will not believe this story is real. It is. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Thank you. Genuinely. Thank you for spending this time with history. The people in these stories cannot speak for themselves anymore. We speak for them when we remember them. And this community does that better than anywhere else on the internet. See you in the next one.